Hello and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is G. Mark Hardy, and today we're going to talk about software as a service security posture management. Now, if you're wondering, what's that? Then you definitely need to listen. And if you already know about the importance of SaaS security, then you're in as well. So this show is for all of you, and to make it even better, I've got a special guest, Ben Johnson from Obsidian Security, and we'll talk in more detail about what you need to do to protect your part of the enterprise that involves the cloud. I think you find this is a very worthwhile episode, so please do us a small favor. Give us a like or a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and those ratings really help us reach our peers. It only takes a click, and thank you for helping out our security leadership community. So what do we mean by SaaS, security posture management? Well, let's start with some basics. Today, most companies have already begun their journey into the cloud. And if you're in the midst of a cloud transformation, you should ask yourself 3 important questions. 1, how many clouds are we in? 2, what data are we sending to the cloud to help the business? Number 3, how do we know the cloud environments we are using are properly configured? Now, let's walk through each of these questions to understand the cyber risks we need to communicate to the business, as well as focus on one cloud type that might be forecasting a major event. So let's look at the first question. How many clouds are we in? It's pretty common to find organizations still hosting data in an on-premise data center. And this data is also likely backed up in a second location, just in case a disaster event occurs and knocks out the main location. For example, if you live in Florida, like me, you can expect a hurricane. And when this does happen, you might expect the data center to lose power and internet connectivity. In the worst case, you might end up with some flooding or physical damage to the building. But in either situation, it's smart to have a backup location somewhere else that would be unlikely to be impacted by the same regional event. So we can think of our primary data center and our backup data center as an on-premises cloud. Therefore, it's the first cloud that we encounter. The second cloud we're likely to encounter is external. Most organizations have made the shift to using cloud computing service providers such as Amazon Web Services, Azure, the Google Cloud Platform, or even Alibaba. And each of these cloud providers has a multitude of offerings designed to help organizations reduce the need to host IT services on premises. Now, if you're using both on-prem and a cloud computing provider such as AWS, you are in what is known as a hybrid cloud environment. Now, if you use multiple cloud computing providers such as AWS and Azure, then you are in a multi-cloud environment. Now, note the difference between the terms. Hybrid cloud means you host on-premises and use an external cloud provider, whereas multi-cloud means you use multiple external cloud providers. Now, if you're using a common cloud platform like AWS, Azure, or Google Compute, then you can look into a Gartner Magic Quadrant category known as Cloud Workload Protection Platforms. And here you might encounter vendors like Palo Alto Prisma Cloud or Wiz or Orca who will provide you with recommendations for your cloud configuration settings. So let's say your organization uses on-prem and AWS, but not Azure or Google. Does that mean you have only 2 clouds? Probably not. You see, there's one more type of cloud-hosted service that you need to understand how to defend. And the most common cloud model organizations leverage is software as a service, or SaaS. Frankly, we don't hear about SaaS security being discussed much, which is why we're doing a deep dive on it in security in this episode. We think there's a real danger of SaaS clouds turning from a nice cloud that gently cools down a hot summer day into a severe weather storm that can cause a major event. So let's look at SaaS security in a little more depth. SaaS refers to cloud-hosted solutions whereby vendors maintain most everything. They run the application, they host the data, they provide runtime environments, middleware, operating systems, virtualization technologies, servers, storage, networking. It can be a huge win to run SaaS solutions since it minimizes the need to have IT staff running all these IT services. And the savings extend to infrastructure maintenance. For example, hiring an HVAC vendor to ensure we have proper heating and cooling for servers on-prem is an expense that doesn't add any additional sales revenue to the business. Now, if I've made my case that SaaS is important, you should ask yourself, to how many external SaaS providers are we sending sensitive data? Every company is different, but most can expect to find dozens to hundreds of SaaS-based solutions. Here are some examples of external SaaS solutions commonly encountered by most businesses: Microsoft 365 or G Suite. It's used for what? Everything: document creation, spreadsheets, management, and of course, email. How about Salesforce for your customer relationship management? ServiceNow or Jira for a ticketing service? Workday for HR information? GitHub as a source repository for developers? Zoom for virtual teleconferences? Slack for instant messaging and team coordination? Okta for identity and access management? And the list goes on and on. Now, if you start thinking about it that way, we're saying, yeah, there's a lot more SaaS than I really gave credit for. See, basically, if you didn't write the code and you're not running it on your own machines, then it's probably software as a service. And once you build out an inventory of your third-party hosted SaaS solutions, you need to understand the second question: what kind of data is being sent to each service? In many instances, it's likely to be sensitive or proprietary data. Customer PII and PCI data might be stored in Salesforce. Diversity or medical information, PHI for employees, would be stored in Workday. Sensitive algorithms and proprietary software code could be stored in GitHub, and so on. And therefore, if it is data that we care about, then we need to ensure it doesn't get into the wrong hands. We need to understand why we care about SaaS-based security, which is commonly known as SaaS Security Posture Management. And let's consider the 4 major benefits of adopting this type of service. Number 1 is detection of account compromise. Today, bad actors can use man-in-the-middle attacks to trick users into giving up their passwords and even the MFA token values. And these attacks can also provide the session cookie credentials that allow a website to know a user has already been authenticated. If attackers replay these session cookie credentials, there's no malware on the endpoints. And this means that antivirus and EDR tools don't have the telemetry they need to detect an account compromise. Therefore, you need log data from the SaaS providers to see anomalous activity, such as changing IP addresses on the application. Now, note we talked about this attack in much more detail in episode 87, From Hunt Team to Hunter, with Bryce Kuntz. In addition to detecting account compromises, we see that SaaS security posture management solutions also improve detection times and response capabilities. Number 2. So, let's just say that someone in your organization has their login credentials for Microsoft 365 compromised, and they're made available on the dark web. Remember, Microsoft 365 is the new official name for Office 365. So bad actor can buy those credentials and log into your Microsoft 365 environment. Next, the intruder begins downloading every sensitive file and folder they can find. Now, do you have a solution that monitors Microsoft 365 activity for data loss prevention? And if not, then you're going to be missing that data breach as it's happening, and you'll find out when the FBI shows up at your doorstep informing you of your, undetected compromise. So be sure to implement solutions that both log and monitor your SaaS providers so you can improve your SaaS incident detection and response capabilities. A third benefit we have seen is improvements to configurations and compliance. You can think of news articles where companies were publicly shamed when they lost sensitive data by leaving it in a public Amazon S3 bucket when it should have been private. Similarly, there are settings in most SaaS solutions that need to be configured properly. The truth is, many of these settings are not secure by default. For most vendors, usability trumps security. So if you're not looking at your SaaS configuration settings in detail, then you run an increased risk of sensitive data compromise. Here's an all too common scenario. Let's say your company hires an intern to write a custom Salesforce page that shows customer documents containing PII, and the new intern releases updates to the web page every 2 weeks. Unfortunately, the intern was never trained in all the Salesforce best practices and creates a misconfiguration that allows customer invoices to be discovered by other customers. How long would this vulnerability be in production before it's detected by a bad actor? And if you think the answer is less than 90 days, then performing yearly penetration tests is insufficient to detect in time the potential brand damage your company is likely to incur. You need to implement a control that finds vulnerabilities in hours or days, not months. This control might notify you of compliance drift in real time when your Salesforce configuration stopped meeting a CIS benchmark. Now you could pay a penetration testing provider thousands of dollars each week to continually assess your Salesforce environment, but that would be cost prohibitive. But if you really want to do this, let me know. I can help you spend your money. So focus on being proactive by switching from manual processes such as pen testing to things that can be automated with tools and monitoring and regular reporting. The fourth major benefit of adopting SaaS security posture management is proper access and privilege management. For critical business applications, you often need to enforce least privilege and prevent the harm that one person can cause. Therefore, it's common to require two or more people to perform a security related function. For example, one developer writes new code for a customer facing website, and another developer reviews the code to detect if there's any major bugs or glaring issues that might result in a compromise. However, one thing I've learned is that over time, projects come and projects go, but access rights accumulate. And having a solution that helps mitigate privilege creep ensures that developers don't increase their access without your knowledge. Another example of the importance of proper access management occurs when bad employees are fired. Well, when a bad employee is fired, then the company needs to immediately remove their access to sensitive data and applications. And this is pretty easy when you control access via a single sign on solution. You just disable their account in one place. However, many SaaS providers don't integrate with single sign on or SAML. And additionally, the SaaS website is nearly always internet accessible, so people can work from home even if they're not on a corporate VPN. Therefore, it's common to encounter scenarios where bad employees are fired and their account access is not removed in a timely manner. The manager probably doesn't remember the 15 SaaS accounts they granted to an employee over a 3-year time frame. When fired employees are terminated and access isn't removed, even if you don't encounter any malicious activity, you can expect an audit finding, especially if it's on a SOX compliant application. Okay, so now that we've talked about the four major drivers of SaaS security posture management: detection of account compromise, improved detection and response times, improvements to configuration and compliance, and proper access and privilege management, let's learn from today's guest who can tell us about some best practices with respect to implementation. Well, I'm privileged to introduce today's guest, Ben Johnson. Ben's the Chief Technology Officer of Obsidian Security, and he's been involved with some rather interesting security startups in the past. Ben, welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, we've talked a few times before, and I knew I wanted to get you on the show because you've got some really great insights that I thought we want to share with our audience. But first of all, can you tell everybody here a little bit about yourself? Where'd you come from? What are you doing? And how'd you end up where you're at now?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think it's always good to hear people's story, and hopefully it helps others navigate their own careers and journeys. I think one thing that's going on with cybersecurity is people are feeling that there's a lot of work. And so I think one thing I wanted to start with is I am married with 3 kids. And the reason I bring that up is I think we all have to remember that we have families, and this is, they're sort of on this cybersecurity journey with us. But I think what's more interesting to the audience is the professional journey. I actually got my start by watching the movie Enemy of the State. And I said, wow, this is really cool. NSA, like, what is this? And at the time, it was no such agency. So I literally applied to NSA the next day, ended up working in the intelligence community for about 7 years. Great time, TSSCI, classified work and different parts of the government and that kind of thing. Ended up then deciding I wanted to try the private sector and met up with some buddies from the intelligence community, and accelerating the story a little bit, ended up coming up in part with the idea for Carbon Black and helped to create the whole EDR type space and technology, and saw that go from basically nothing through various aspects of the journey, about 800 people, and then decided I wanted to do it again. So ended up joining Glenn and Matt to start Obsidian Security, where we're really focused on SaaS and really the lack of good quality SaaS security tools. So I could probably spend all day talking about various things I skipped over, but that's my journey from Enemy of the State to now sitting here with you.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I think that for anybody who is or has worked in the government, there's always kind of wondering, like, what's it going to be like when I get out there? And you typically find out that the skills, the training, the expertise, and the opportunities that you get when you're serving either in the .gov or in my case, the .mil world really pan out very nicely. And you also get exposed to things in that type of world that you typically don't get run into in the .com world. But your focus then has been startups, not large companies. So I got to imagine as Carbon Black got up to around 800 people, you're starting to kind of get there where you're building bureaucracies and things like that. But do you find that small companies, well, I was going to say, can you compare it to a large one, but you haven't worked for a big one other than the government? Are there any cultural differences that you've seen from a startup perspective versus maybe an established organization?
Yeah, I think I've tried to figure out what has drawn me so much to more of the entrepreneurial path and spirit. And I think it really was those days in the government where certainly there's jobs where government is not moving fast or whatever. But I was very fortunate to be part of some incredible teams that were very tied to operational need. And basically, someone would come to us and say, you need to invent something by this weekend or we're not going to like what happens. And so it was very urgent, very kind of mission focused, supporting some pretty incredible things. And so that I think just, kind of parlayed over into or translated over into, wow, I really like this whole, like, you can't just Google the answer. You have to build something, you have to write code, you have to build together different technologies, libraries, what have you. And solve problems. And then I think the types of people that tend to be more drawn to that are the ones that, have that bias to action, that they really want to have an impact. And, that's not to say you can't work for a large company and have the same mentality or have the same impact or maybe even larger impact. But I just like the fact that there's a lot of kind of uncertainty and you just have to kind of bulldoze through it and come up with the solution.
It's pretty cool. So for those who are thinking about what's it like on the outside, I remember giving a talk years ago called Poning Time. I think it was a keynote for TourCon in San Diego back in 2010. So it's been a while. And it was an area where I was addressing to people, what if you wanted to leave your regular corporate shtick and go to a startup? And everybody thinks I'm hanging from the end of a rope in a totally dark room and it's got to be 50, 70, 100 feet to the floor and it's going to fall and it's going to break into pieces. And when you finally let go, boom, you realize you're only about 2 inches off the ground. You could have let go at any time because no one's going to condemn you for trying your startup or trying to be independent and then hopping back on the corporate ladder. It doesn't damage you in any way. But boy, if you can do well without those restrictions that come with large organizations, as well as, well, the resources, so you really have to be innovative, then small business can be wonderful. And you've now been part of two excellent teams, Carbon Black and now Obsidian, which I think is pretty neat. And so your focus has been on security. And in particular, on this episode, we've been talking about software as a service security and really kind of the whole issue behind SaaS security posture management. And so is this being addressed well in the marketplace? I would think the answer might be no, otherwise you wouldn't have created something. But what's your perception? How do you see it as somebody who deals with this every day?
I think SaaS security, SSPM, et cetera, is really starting to take hold. The market's starting to understand we need something. And back when we started this in 2017, you go talk to a CISO, a security engineer, someone that's in the trenches, and you're like, hey, how are you defending Salesforce, or what are you doing about G Suite? And they'd be like, well, I got something like Okta, an identity management provider. Maybe I have MFA like a Duo or something. But once people log in, I have no idea what's happening. And that was kind of frightening. And when you think about some of the data that's stored in these systems, but the industry has continued to evolve, continued to have more and more cloud focus. Obviously, the sort of work from anywhere pandemic, environment really, I think, accelerated some of the distributed and remote tools and cloud-based workflows and things, which were already the trend, but within a week or two in 2020 needed to be deployed to everyone, right? Zoom and everything else. And so I think teams have realized, hey, these workflows are part of our future. They're really part of our current. And now we need security tooling to help give our teams both kind of left of boom and right of boom capabilities, which we can talk about more.
Right. Now, it would seem to me that if you've got a successful software as a service tool, whether it's Microsoft 365 or you mentioned Zoom or anything else, I mean, by golly, with the amount of money they're bringing in, you'd think they'd do security perfectly, that it would be absolutely excellent. And with all those resources that they had available, there wouldn't be a problem. But that's not really what happens, is it?
Yeah, I mean the you're correct. The shared responsibility model, I think it is great that we don't have to worry about, patching the underlying servers that are powering Microsoft 365 or Workday or whatever. However, it's still our responsibility, right? I think people forget that. Like it's our responsibility for who has access, what data is getting put in, what are the configuration settings and such. And I think all of these providers, it's all about availability and ease of adoption. And that's how they're making their money, is selling the productivity side of the house. And so security, I think, is still an area of catch up for most of these providers, where even if they are generating some alerts or some detections or something, it's so different from all the other apps that teams really don't want to have to go bouncing from application to application to try to defend them.
And it's also really a split responsibility model, isn't it? You can't just outsource your risk to the SaaS provider and then say if something goes wrong, well, it's their fault. We paid the invoice, so they're not supposed to let bad things happen. You lose if something goes wrong there. Plus, it's got to interface with something, so we all have something on our side as well. So it seems to be that there's a fairly unique challenge now in this split responsibility model with the SaaS providers. And since many of them aren't going to give you source code, I don't think any of them will, or let you go probe around their systems or do your own SOC audits and things like that, we really have to rely on some other type of a tool set to watch what's going on and then try to monitor that information flow back and forth and then say, that just doesn't quite look right. Because as far as the SaaS provider is concerned, they don't really know what looks right other than perhaps some really bad stuff or known bad, but every organization, even every user, has their own unique footprint. And so as a result, how do we go about learning that? It's kind of almost a behavioral based model to say, for example, I was on travel last week over in Europe. And I took a look at my console and it says, warning, G. Mark Hardy did impossible travel. He was here, then he was there. It's like, well, I know that. It's me, so I can dismiss that alert. But I didn't get that alert from Microsoft, and I didn't get that alert from any other tool, but I did get it with Obsidian. Now, so full disclosure here, I am a paying customer, but that's not why you're on the show. And this is not obviously an infomercial. But what I get out of that tool as a CISO is the ability to drill down and look at things and say, that just doesn't look right, as well as have log abilities that sometimes exceed what I would get from my software as a service provider. And so I think I'm kind of reverse engineering some of the things that you guys have created. So as companies move their things out to the cloud, I have to imagine that from time to time they end up getting compromises and things like that. Have you heard about anything that maybe we haven't heard about already in the news with regard to organizations having their data compromised because they've been entrusted them into third-party software as a service environments?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things, right? First and foremost, these applications are tricky for security teams and really the organization as a whole to try to figure out who owns what aspect of the application, right? So you have vertically, you have, basically the shared responsibility or split responsibility between the SaaS provider and your company. But then you essentially have this horizontal distribution where maybe there's an application owner with availability and some of the configuration. Maybe IT is responsible for kind of IAM and some aspects of just accessing these systems, and then security is meant to do threat detection, hardening recommendations, things like that. And so it creates a quite a challenging environment where now you have multiple teams with slightly or sometimes very different incentives and goals, KPIs, OKRs, et cetera. So first and foremost, I think that's a challenge. And then, secondly, you do have threat actors, whether internal or external, who have figured out that most of your data maybe now lives in SharePoint or GitHub or whatever. And so, yeah, we certainly see, unfortunately, every week pretty much, we see, account compromise, we see insider threat activity, but sometimes it's not malicious, right? It's accidental. You have maybe 50,000 employees trying to do their job, trying to share files and do things, and they accidentally share something with any anonymous user, or they just kind of make a mistake, or the admin accidentally turns off MFA, and then it just makes it a little bit easier for the bad guys, right? So yeah, we certainly see things, but to give you some specific examples, we certainly see systems like Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace targeted for business email compromise, right? And we work with incident response firms every single week, and usually it's a Friday night, right? But we work with them every single week to deploy Obsidian because it is a rapid deployment scenario. But the point is that these systems are being targeted for business email compromise for various reasons. Could be more sophisticated and espionage driven, or it could just be I'm trying to use your account to spam everyone. We do see people who are on the way out the door that start sharing everything with their Gmail account, or we start seeing people downloading everything from something like GitHub before they depart. And unfortunately, that's usually not a positive thing for anyone involved. And then we see just things that are more just hygienic around, like I've seen a chief medical officer at a huge healthcare company forwarding all their email to a Yahoo address. And there's no malintent there, but should all of these sensitive emails or potentially sensitive emails for someone at such a high level in the organization be going out to basically a personal email box? No. So we see it all. And again, I could probably spend all day talking about this, but the risk is real.
And I think some of us have kind of cringed a little bit as you've mentioned a few things like, yeah, I've seen that happen before. And yet oftentimes they just pull rank and said, well, make it happen. Yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and off you go. And so as a result, if we're faced with a situation where we don't get the control sets on the SaaS tools, usually IT is running that, not the cybersecurity team. We get to go ahead and take a look at the testing tools to find vulnerabilities, and we get to see maybe findings and things like that. But we're not adjusting the knobs necessarily. And as a result, because that's out of reach, it kind of brings this case around again to the idea of a SaaS software security posture management tool to say, how do we get a handle on this? And if someone says, okay, I get it, G-Mark, this is a really useful thing. I want to do something now. What's the path? What's the most difficult thing for someone to set this whole thing up in the first place? Is it put disk one into drive A and press enter and secure your enterprise? Or is it a lot more complicated than that? And what's involved?
It's actually the opposite, which is it's quite easy to get started. Really, I would say, trying to think about what's the hardest aspect of this, it's not technical. It's the fact that this is a newer area that maybe you're just not accustomed to, or you haven't, considered before. And so really just saying, what, we're going to do this. That's the, typically the sort of bottleneck in the whole process. Once you say go, the cool thing with SaaS is you're typically integrating with these products through OAuth or an API token. So there's nothing to, you're not deploying an agent on every employee's box or something like that. And, typically there's reasons maybe you'd want write access, to take action or something, but typically you can start with read-only access. So you're confident you're not going to, the application owner is confident the security team's not going to just turn something off or whatever. And so really it's just that mentality of like, let's do something, right? But once you get going, it's typically like day one, you're getting value from, a product like this where it's saying, hey, here's all your weaknesses, or at least here's the weaknesses you should start with. Maybe you don't want to see all of them. And then here's maybe some, threats. Here's some suspicious activity or, malicious activity. And so, I think it's really cool to get started because it's so easy to deploy something like this, and right away you're getting insights.
So what it's really doing then is ingesting logs and other types of activities, but not inundating the analyst with this huge volume of data. But rather, it's if I'm understanding this correctly, you get a dashboard which says, hey, we've reduced out the noise based upon rule sets. It can adapt, and then you say, this is what you really ought to be looking at. If you had 20 minutes to focus on cybersecurity, and then you had to run out the door, what should you be doing for 19 and a half of those minutes? And would we be able to do something like that with a tool like this, where it would bubble up to the top based upon, here's our best assessment of what might be risky. Now, it might be false positive, but the fact is, it's probably not noise. And so I can see this, as you had mentioned early in our conversation about family time being important. This could actually go a long way toward keeping you from having to pick through a bunch of stuff late at night, it would seem.
Well, that's the hope. But, I think it's really about integrating with workflows, right? And I don't want to sound too formal or anything, but I think security programs, you're trying to build that, journey from something happens to something is, kind of remediated or cleaned up. and how do you do that with the staff, which is, usually lean teams, right? But how do you do that with the staff and the various security tools and tech stack and everything? And so I think it's about, you plug something in and you immediately want, 24/7 kind of threat monitoring, threat management, detect the bad and help me investigate the suspicious and things like that. But then it's not just about that. It's about, whether you call it shift left or getting upstream or whatever, sort of the protect and NIST, right? The left of boom, help me harden, help me find the essentially SaaS equivalent of vulnerability management and figure out, like, how do I fix my weaknesses? How do I lock things down without impacting productivity, right? I think that's really a parallel work stream, because you want to throw the detections, the alerts, et cetera, into your existing kind of threat focused team and SOC or whomever is doing that, but you want to continually drive the organization to get better.
And that sounds like a really good thing to be able to do. When you start out, I would imagine, are you kind of in a reactive mode? And then at some point in time, you get this intelligence, the insight, and then can kind of move over toward more of a proactive approach, as I think you're suggesting. How long does that transition typically take?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to willingness to, go have conversations with, someone like application owners. But I think I can actually break it down into kind of three different areas, right? So, I think before we go into any three areas, I think one of the challenges is none of us grew up defending SaaS, right? I mean, most of us that have, been around 20 plus years or whatever, we've reverse engineered malware. We've played around with, different buffer overflows and all sorts of stuff, right? Like we looked at Wireshark and various network packets and whatever, but we have years, if not decades of experience doing that stuff, or at least someone on the team does. But when you talk about defending Salesforce or looking at ServiceNow misconfigurations or whatever, this is kind of bleeding edge, or at least very recent history type stuff. And so there's this barrier to entry of just, okay, well, I don't even know what to learn, or, I don't know what I don't know, kind of thing. And then if you multiply that times a bunch of different SaaS apps, each of which is different logs, different events, I think that's a lot of the challenge, is just kind of diving in, getting started and ramping up. Having said all that, I think if you break it down into really three different areas, it's kind of the threat focused detect and respond workflow, get an alert, respond, clean up, tune it, maybe add new detections, et cetera. That kind of team. Then on the hardening side, and I think this is where teams are really trying to build up their capabilities, or kind of get more aggressive. You actually can split it in half, or at least in pieces. One of which is, what application settings, or what at this more administrator level can I go work on? What can I go fix, harden, et cetera, right? And that's typically a partnership between the application owner, who again might be in IT, but it might live in HR or sales or marketing or whatever. So I think there's that level that's more global impact. But then you have this this kind of, often, unfortunately, it's kind of a mess of, you have 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, whatever employees, users, contractors, et cetera, using some of these tools. And you have this whole area of hygiene around, how are they sharing files? How are they adding integrations, third-party apps? Are they adding some random chess game into Slack or whatever? We've kind of seen it all. How many Amazon Alexas have they connected up to read their email to them in the morning or whatever? But that's not necessarily working with the admins. Yes, you should include them, but that's kind of like, well, how do I tackle this population hygiene problem? And do I automatically unshare files, or do I automatically publish a top 10 most wanted list of, like, you're the 10 people that have installed the most integrations and you don't want to be on that list, kind of thing? We've kind of seen it all, but you got to think about these different ways to start tackling some of this risk. And fortunately, we're seeing teams get a bit more aggressive and want to do something here.
And so what they're now armed with is the knowledge of what's actually happening, instead of having to guess at it or pour through tons of logs. And depending upon their relationship with management and then the team they're on, or the company they're working with, they can come out there. And usually naming and shaming is not a lead technique in the security that makes you endeared to others. But there is a place for it, and kind of maybe a lightweight wall of shame, or even just notifying people privately rather than posting it up, oh, you're the worst offender in the organization, could have some effect on that. And it all comes down to being able to see what's going on, to look across these different clouds, to know what the potential risks are that are being induced both by configuration settings as well as user behavior, and maybe endemic within the SaaS platform itself. For example, looking at threat information and new vulnerabilities come out, it says, yeah, we need to go fix that thing, and you probably should go do that. So if a CISO is looking to kind of move in this direction and say, all right, what would I look for when I'm trying to come up with a solution there? Are there any things that would represent guidance in terms of how you would potentially select a particular solution?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you need to say, hey, technology is a huge part here, because you don't want to bounce from SaaS app to SaaS app again, some of which your security team might not have a lot of access to, because it's just sort of protected by the team, which is a good intent. I mean, they're trying to protect who has admin access because they don't want a whole bunch of admins or whatever. But in terms of technology, I think you got to focus on both proactive, hardening, that kind of thing, as well as the ongoing monitoring. Reactive has sometimes sounds negative, but the whole detection and response, threat management, like bad stuff is unfortunately either going to happen, or at least people are trying to make it happen to something like Microsoft 365. So you have to look for it, you have to monitor for it and be able to respond to it. And then, an area that we're seeing a lot of interest in as well is really these integrations, right? So you got to try to harden and protect and detect and respond to your kind of key sanctioned SaaS apps. But now all of these apps have marketplaces, and they're all about integrations, and that's great. Like, I can send data from Google to Slack to Microsoft to Salesforce, whatever. But there's just an explosion of these integrations as well. So you got to think about, well, how am I getting visibility into what all my, again, it could be admins, but it could be users as well when users are integrating. So I think you have to think about skill sets and needs from a security program perspective. But what we've seen is pretty much everyone out there needs continuous monitoring, SOC, IR, detect and respond, management kind of thing. But you also need the proactive discovery, assessment, hygiene, hardening around the application and the integrations involved.
And what I think I heard you kind of mentioning in there almost subtly is you don't want to end up with 22 different point solutions for 22 different cloud providers. It'd be nice if you could have a single pane of glass. And that sounds aspirational for some of us, and for other folks who are working on it, said, hey, it's coming, or it's there. Go take a look at it and go explore your solution sets. So this has been, wow, really helpful and fascinating. So thank you for the time. Any other final comments or insights or words of wisdom you might have for our listeners?
Yeah, the risk is there. Please, please take a look at what you're doing around some of these key SaaS apps, whether it's a proactive hardening approach or a detect and respond approach. Really, you need both. And it's also about, how does it integrate into your overall operational workflows in terms of where do alerts flow? Is it a SIM, a data lake, a SOAR? How do you pull information and give it to the team that's doing the hardening, or even compliance, or other things too, where you better believe your SaaS apps are in scope for these compliance obligations. So I think it's really just, hey, this is here. There's a lot of risk. Your sometimes entire company is running on SaaS. Kind of what are you doing about, securing it? And, you can still have the exact same productivity, but you can harden it and make it safer.
And I think that's an excellent way to kind of wrap up. You can harden it, but keep the productivity and do it well. And that's really our challenge that we have, and really our commitment as security leaders, is to deliver on the business mission of enabling the organization to function. Revenue protection, as we like to say, is kind of one of your primary jobs here. And you do that by avoiding breaches, by unnecessary expenses and downtime and things like that. So, Ben, thank you for your time and insight. And for those who are listening, thanks again for including CISO Tradecraft in your professional development regimen. We hope you've enjoyed learning about the various clouds we're in: the on-premises cloud, the cloud computing vendors, and the software as a service, and the four major benefits of a SaaS security posture management. If you remember them: 1, detecting account compromise; 2, improving detection and response times; 3, improving configuration and compliance; and 4, proper access and privilege management. And so we recommend evaluating a SaaS security posture management tools for your organization and implement what you choose and make it a better handle on your overall security. And I'd also like to thank Obsidian Security for sponsoring today's episode and our special guest, Ben Johnson. Remember, if you liked our today's show, please take 5 seconds and leave us a 5-star review with your podcast provider. We'd appreciate that very much. So this is your host, G. Mark Hardy, and thanks again for listening. And until next time, stay safe.